This morning's scripture lesson comes from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. I'm reading from the Common English Bible. Jesus responded by speaking again in parables. The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding party for his son. He sent his servants to call those invited to the wedding party, but they didn't come. Again, he sent other servants and said to them, "Tell those who've been invited, look, the meal is all prepared. I've butchered the oxen and the fatted cattle. Now everything's ready. Come to the wedding party." But they paid no attention and went away, some to their fields, others to their businesses. The rest of them grabbed his servants, abused them, and killed them. The king was angry. He sent his soldiers to destroy those murderers and set their city on fire. Then he said to his servants, "The wedding party is prepared, but those who were invited weren't worthy. Therefore, go to the roads on the edge of town and invite everyone you find to the wedding party." Then those servants went to the roads and gathered everyone they found, both evil and good. The wedding party was full of guests. Now when the king came in and saw the guests, he spotted a man who wasn't wearing wedding clothes. He said to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without wedding clothes?" But he was speechless. Then the king said to his servants, "Tie his hands and feet and throw him out into the farthest darkness. People there will be weeping and grinding their teeth. Many people are invited, but few people are chosen." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, here's Jesus again telling one of those perplexing, difficult stories we call a parable. And one of the amazing things about parables is that because they're not factual, they don't match reality perfectly, they can give us insights and help us to see the world with different eyes than those we've been using regularly. Lest we get too tied up in only one interpretation of a parable, lest we become convinced that it's crystal clear as to what a parable means. Perhaps we do well to remember that these stories are rather similar to stories of our day that begin once upon a time. One of the first things I think this particular parable makes clear is that it is the king who issues the invitation. The king is the one who decides who's to be included at the banquet table. A common reading of the story suggests that God, the king, first invites the Jews, the chosen people, but they refuse to come. And so as Matthew is writing this gospel for the young church, he assures them that they, the Jesus people, Gentile and Jew alike, have now replaced the Hebrew people who followed the lead of the Pharisees and rejected Jesus. But I wonder if the more important lesson of the story is to serve as a reminder to us that God will invite whom God will invite. How often I want to be the one in control of the invitation list. How often I think I know a person's story. I know if they should be included, if they should be in or out. But ultimately, it's God who does the inviting, and I'd do well to remember that. I'm not God, and I have no right to put up barriers and fences to try to exclude and keep others out of God's kingdom. No, clearly I'm not the king in the story, but just who am I then? You know, one of the helpful ways to read stories in the Bible like this one is to ask yourself, where do I see myself in this story? So, maybe I'm among those early guests who've been invited by the king to the wedding feast of his son. I've been extended the honor of being asked to show up to help the king celebrate this wondrous event. But like the guests in the story, am I too caught up in my own business to even bother with the happenings of the king? When God calls to us, asks us to come, I wonder, do we refuse to be bothered? Is it just too much trouble? Gee, I'd like to, God, but the timing's just not right. Let me get this project done. Let me get my grandkids grown. Let me see this through, and then I promise I'll be there with bells on. How often are we indifferent, even hostile to the idea of taking time, attending the banquet, making time to enjoy our relationship with the one who graciously invites us? We never expect him to be too busy for us, but how often are we so preoccupied, so lost in our own little worlds, that we fail to stop and celebrate with the King? I wonder if those first guests just assumed the King would put everything on hold until they could get around to joining the party. How often do we arrogantly assume that the King fits his life around ours and is there to protect us and serve us, and yet we owe him nothing in return? We assume the King needs us. We are, after all, important members of his kingdom. How surprised might we be to find that the plans aren't altered because of our indifference? The parable teaches us that God does not withdraw the feast. It goes on, and we choose whether to accept or reject the invitation to joy. So maybe you see yourself among those ho-hum, another invitation, guess I'll have to wait people that Jesus is talking about. Or maybe we have the good sense to know that this invitation is one of grace. We don't deserve it. We haven't merited it or earned it. Maybe we're one of those people off the streets who's truly taken aback by the invitation. The King is including me. Wow. Maybe we come to the party all too happy to make pleasing the King a priority in life. Maybe we know that spending a little more time in our fields, shaking a few more hands, putting hours more into our business isn't really going to get us anywhere in God's kingdom. Maybe we've come to realize that there's nothing more important than spending time in the King's company, building relationship with the King. One of the problems, of course, which Jesus had seen happen with the Pharisees he's addressing is that it's easy to move from this latter group to the first. It's a slippery slope from being grateful and loving to being arrogant and proud. How easy to think that because the King has invited us and we've shown up at the party, everything is sewn up and we will be assured a happily ever after. But Matthew's blended a second parable with the first to warn us, don't get uppity. All are invited to feast at the table, but not every response is acceptable. At first reading, the parable seems harsh. The King throws this guy out into the darkness because he's not dressed right. That's not very gracious. I mean, the servants did drag him in off the streets. He's a last-minute guest. So maybe he just didn't have time to prepare for the party, to borrow clothes or to get his out of storage. But again, it's a parable. The guy invited but not allowed to stay has failed to fully appreciate what the King's invitation entails. He's shown up, maybe just to get a good meal, but he hasn't come to really rejoice over the marriage of the Son. In effect, he hasn't really accepted the invitation any more than those who never showed up at all. The King has invited both good and bad, and the only real requirement is the willingness to honor the occasion, to join hearts and rejoice with the King, to be a real guest at the wedding. And in this story, that's signified by wearing a wedding garment. To show up dirty or in your everyday clothes would signal that you didn't really come as a wedding guest. You hadn't really come to celebrate with the King and his Son. Your body's there, but your heart's not in it. I think Matthew is trying to help us understand that the invitation is one of grace offered to all. But to accept it means to accept not only the benefits, but also the responsibilities. If we want to feast at the heavenly banquet, then we have to do our part as citizens of the kingdom of heaven. We have to act like loyal subjects behaving in ways that will please the King. Matthew reminds us that one must show outwardly the transformation that's taken place inwardly. We've been chosen by God to be part of the party. That fact alone should make us grateful and gracious in turn. Because God includes me, how can I then not include you? How can I not clothe myself with compassion and a zeal for justice and a willingness to stand with the oppressed against the wicked? How can I not attire myself with those garments that God would want to find me wearing? How can I not put on Christ, as the Apostle Paul put it? Which reminds us of one more group in the story, the servants. Perhaps we find ourselves there. These are those whose very lives belong to the King. They do his bidding, even when it's dangerous. We get no sense that the servants in the story are stingy with their invitations. In fact, they work hard on behalf of the King to get people to come join the party. They don't lord it over others that they eat the King's food on a regular basis and sleep under his roof every night. They seem assured and at peace that the King cares for them, and they seem to know the King well enough and trust completely that his bounty is enough to include all the others he's invited to join. How many of us can say, "Oh, that's me. I have that servant's heart. I live out of an assurance that the King is generous beyond measure. I've seen his graciousness. I'm a recipient of that graciousness. And I wish everyone else out there could know the joy of serving my Lord and Master." Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad, so the wedding hall was filled with guests. So where are you in the story? An invited guest who refuses an invitation? A guest who goes along with the crowd but whose heart isn't really in it? Or a slave who's learned the wonder of serving a master who cares for you and wants you to invite everyone you see to share in that peace and joy? Look over the story again, and perhaps you'll see, oh, here I am. Oh God, here I am. Amen.